This story is a fictional account based on real events that transpired during a rescue mission conducted by SEAL Team 6 in Yemen back in 2014. Their mission was to rescue hostages held by Al-Qaeda, including an American photojournalist. Although the mission was considered to be a success, there were some casualties. This incident had a very profound impact on the lives of everyone involved, so make sure you listen to the whole story, all the way to the end. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and heat. The small, dimly lit room where Daniel Harris was held captive felt more like a tomb than a cell. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, sweat, and fear. The oppressive heat of the Yemeni desert pressed down on them, sapping their energy and hope. Daniel sat against the rough stone wall, his back aching from days of being hunched over. His clothes, once clean and practical, were now grimy and torn. He glanced around the room at the other hostages, their faces drawn and gaunt. There was Khaled, a Yemeni aid worker, his eyes hollow with despair. Marie, a French doctor, clutching a photo of her children, her hands trembling. And Ibrahim, a local journalist, who had been defiant at first but was now a shadow of his former self. The only sound was the distant murmur of voices, the occasional clatter of a door, and the relentless ticking of time. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whispered conversations of the hostages. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing fragments of their lives, their hopes, and their fears. It was all they had left, tiny pieces of humanity to cling to in the face of overwhelming darkness. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be free. He thought of the open spaces of his hometown in Montana, the crisp mountain air, the smell of pine trees. But the memories felt distant, like a dream he could barely recall. All that remained was the cold, hard reality of their captivity. "Do you think they'll come for us?" Marie's voice was barely a whisper. Daniel opened his eyes and met her gaze. "They will," he said, though the certainty in his voice had faded over the weeks. "They have to." Khaled shook his head. "Al-Qaeda doesn't leave loose ends. If they think we're a liability..." The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Daniel didn't need to hear the rest to know what Khaled meant. They had all seen the videos, hostages kneeling in the desert, blindfolded, waiting for the end. The door creaked open and the hostages tensed, their hearts racing. A guard entered, his rifle slung across his shoulder. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with cold, dead eyes. He barked an order in Arabic, and the hostages stood, their bodies stiff with fear. "Move!" he growled, waving his rifle. They were herded out of the room and down a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with crude graffiti, messages from past captives who had been here before them. Some were prayers, others were names and dates. Daniel wondered how many had made it out alive. The guard led them to a larger room, where a camera was set up on a tripod. Daniel's heart sank as he realized what was coming. Another video, another attempt to force their governments to negotiate, to pay ransom, to do something. But he knew deep down that the chances of that were slim. The guard shoved them into position, forcing them to kneel in front of the camera. Another man, masked and armed, stepped forward and began to speak in Arabic. His voice was harsh and filled with venom. Daniel didn't need to understand the language to know what he was saying. Demands, threats, promises of retribution if their captors' demands were not met. As the man ranted, Daniel's mind drifted. He thought of his family, of his parents back in the States, of his friends, of the life he had left behind to chase stories in dangerous places. He had always known the risks, but he had never imagined it would end like this. The video ended, and the hostages were led back to their cell. The door clanged shut behind them, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel slumped against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He glanced at Marie, who was silently weeping, her hands covering her face. "We have to hold on," Daniel whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "We have to." But as the hours dragged on, hope felt like a distant memory, and the darkness closed in around them. The briefing room was dimly lit and the air was thick with tension. The SEAL Team 6 operatives sat around a large table, their faces grim as they listened to the briefing. Weeks of prep and dry runs had brought them to this point. The mission was clear. A group of hostages, including an American photojournalist, was being held by Al-Qaeda in a remote compound in Yemen. The intelligence was solid, but the risks were high. Lieutenant Commander Jack Reynolds, the team leader, stood at the front of the room, his voice steady and authoritative. He was a seasoned operative with years of experience in high-stakes missions. His eyes, however, betrayed the weight of the responsibility he carried. "We have reliable intel on the location of the hostages," Reynolds said, pointing to a satellite image projected on the wall. "The compound is heavily fortified, with multiple guards and a network of tunnels underneath. This will be a high-risk operation. The operatives listened in silence, their expressions a mix of determination and concern. They were the best of the best, but even they knew that missions like this could go wrong in an instant. Reynolds continued, outlining the plan. We'll insert under the cover of darkness, infiltrate the compound, neutralize the guards, and extract the hostages. Speed and precision are key. We need to be in and out before they even know we're there. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Intel suggests the hostages are in a central building, likely the basement. We'll be dealing with tight spaces, low visibility, and close quarters combat. The margin for error is 0. The team nodded, their minds already running through the countless scenarios that could unfold. They had trained for this, drilled every possible outcome, but the reality of combat was always unpredictable. Any questions? Reynolds asked, his gaze sweeping the room. Petty Officer Marcus Mac McCall, the team's medic, raised his hand. What do we know about the hostages' condition? Intel is limited, Reynolds admitted. They've been held for weeks, possibly months. Expect them to be weak, possibly injured. We'll need to move fast once we have them. Mac nodded, already mentally preparing for what he might face. He had seen the aftermath of captivity before, malnourished bodies, broken spirits, eyes that had lost all hope. But this time, he hoped they would be in time to save them. Reynolds continued, Our extraction point is here. He pointed to a clearing a few kilometers from the compound. Once we have the hostages, we'll move quickly to the extraction zone. We expect heavy resistance, so stay sharp. The briefing ended, and the team dispersed to prepare. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. Each man had his own way of coping. Some double-checked their gear, others sat in silence, their minds focused on the task ahead. Reynolds watched them, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had led countless missions, but the thought of losing any of his men, or the hostages, was always at the forefront of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was different, that the stakes were higher than ever before. As the team gathered for final checks, Reynolds took a moment to himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the mission. They had a job to do, and failure was not an option. Let's bring them home, he said, his voice resolute. The team nodded, and with a final check of their gear, they moved out, ready to face the darkness that awaited them. The night was black as ink, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air was barely audible above the wind, but to the men of SEAL Team 6, it was a familiar lullaby. The CH-47 Chinook, painted in black and devoid of markings, flew low over the rugged terrain of Yemen, its cargo compartment filled with grim-faced operatives. Lieutenant Commander Jack Reynolds sat in silence, his hands gripping the straps of his harness. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding among the team that tonight would be one of their most dangerous missions yet. Each man was deep in his own thoughts, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. The Chinook banked slightly, and Reynolds glanced out of the small porthole. Below, the desert stretched out in all directions, a desolate landscape of sand and rock. In the distance, the faint lights of the compound could be seen, a cluster of buildings surrounded by a high wall. The target. 5 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Reynolds nodded to himself, then turned to his team. Listen up, we're going in hot. Remember your training, stay focused, and watch each other's backs. We've got one shot at this. The team members responded with silent nods, their faces set with determination. They were ready. They had to be. As the helicopter approached the insertion point, the men moved into position. The rear ramp began to lower, and the cold night air rushed into the fuselage. The team members, clad in black tactical gear and armed to the teeth, lined up, their eyes fixed on the desert below. The Chinook hovered just a few feet above the ground, its rotors kicking up a cloud of dust and sand. Without hesitation, the SEALs leaped from the ramp, landing in the soft sand with practiced ease. They moved quickly, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Reynolds was the last to exit, his boots sinking into the sand as he hit the ground. He signaled to the pilot, who lifted the Chinook back into the air, the noise of the rotors fading as it sped away. The team regrouped, their black-clad figures barely visible in the darkness. They moved with silent precision, their footsteps muffled by the sand. Reynolds took point, his senses heightened, every nerve in his body on edge. The compound was less than a kilometer away, and they needed to reach it undetected. The terrain was rough, uneven, and littered with rocks. The men moved in single file, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing and the occasional crunch of sand underfoot. As they neared the compound, Reynolds signaled for the team to halt. He crouched low, pulling out a pair of night vision goggles and scanning the area. The compound was a dark silhouette against the night sky, its walls high and foreboding. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. 2 guards at the main gate, Reynolds whispered into his radio, switching to thermals. He adjusted the goggles, switching to thermal imaging. The figures of the guards glowed a faint white against the cooler backdrop of the desert. He counted them off, noting their positions and the timing of their patrols. "Target acquired," he said quietly. "On my mark." The team moved into position, spreading out around the compound. They were ghosts in the night, invisible to the enemy, but ready to strike at a moment's notice. Reynolds could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the familiar rush that came before a raid. Mark. In an instant, the silence was shattered. Suppressed gunfire crackled through the air, and the 2 guards at the gate crumpled to the ground, their bodies falling limp in the sand. The team moved in, swift and deadly, scaling the wall with practiced ease. Reynolds reached the top of the wall, pulling himself up and over in one smooth motion. He dropped down on the other side, landing softly on the hard-packed earth. The compound was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a generator. The team fanned out, moving through the shadows like wraiths. They were inside the compound now, deep in enemy territory. Every corner, every doorway could be hiding a threat, but they had a mission to complete, and failure was not an option. Reynolds signaled to Mac, who approached the main building with a breaching charge. The medic worked quickly, attaching the charge to the door and stepping back. The rest of the team took cover, their weapons trained on the entrance. Breaching in 3, 2, 1. The door exploded inward with a deafening blast, and the SEALs stormed in, weapons raised, ready to face whatever waited for them inside. The inside of the building was a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms, each one a potential death trap. The team moved swiftly, clearing each room with brutal efficiency. The air was saturated with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the building, amplified by the close quarters. Reynolds led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the shouts of the hostage-takers, the crack of their rifles as they returned fire. But the SEALs were relentless, their movements precise and calculated. Every shot was a kill. Every room they cleared brought them one step closer to the hostages. They reached a stairwell leading down to the basement. This was it. The hostages had to be down there. Reynolds paused, glancing at the team. They reached a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. Reynolds signaled for me to breach it, and I set to work. The rest of the team took up positions, their weapons trained on the door as well as other possible points around them where a threat could make its appearance, ready to move at a moment's notice. The door burst open with a loud bang and the team stormed in. The room was small and cramped with low ceilings and no windows. In the center of the room, huddled together on the floor, were the hostages. Daniel Harris looked up in disbelief as the door was blown off its hinges. For a moment, he couldn't process what was happening. The noise, the smoke, the sight of heavily armed men storming into the room. It was all too much. But then he realized what was happening. Rescue. They were being rescued. The SEALs moved quickly, securing the room and checking the hostages for injuries. Mac knelt beside Daniel, his eyes scanning the photojournalist for any signs of harm. "Are you okay?" Mac asked, his voice calm but urgent. Daniel nodded, too stunned to speak. He felt like he was in a dream, like any moment he would wake up back in the cell, the hope of rescue nothing more than a cruel illusion. "We're getting you out of here," Mac said, helping Daniel to his feet. "Can you walk?" "I think so," Daniel muttered, his voice shaky. Mac turned to the other hostages, assessing their condition. Marie was weak but unharmed. Khaled had a minor injury to his leg, but he could walk. Ibrahim was in the worst shape, his body bruised and battered, but he was still conscious. The team formed a protective circle around the hostages, leading them out of the basement and back into the building. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the possibility of danger. Every step felt like it could be their last, every corner a potential ambush. As they moved through the building, the sound of gunfire grew louder. The enemy was regrouping, mounting a counterattack. Reynolds could feel the pressure mounting, the sense of urgency driving them forward. They reached the exit, and the cool night air rushed in. For a moment, it felt like they were home free, but as they stepped outside, the sound of gunfire erupted from the darkness. The hostages were caught in the crossfire, their bodies pressed against the wall as they tried to stay out of the line of fire. Reynolds felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. They were so close, so close. But the enemy was closing in, and time was running out. "Move! Move!" Reynolds shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. The night air was filled with the crack of gunfire and the acrid smell of burning gunpowder as the SEALs fought their way out of the compound. Every second counted. Every step was a struggle. The hostages were pressed between the heavily armed SEALs, their fear palpable. They were so close to freedom, but the danger was far from over. As Reynolds led the group, his senses were on high alert. The path to the extraction point felt endless, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. The compound's walls seemed to close in around them as enemy fire intensified. The shadows of Al-Qaeda fighters flitted between the buildings, their shouts in Arabic mixing with the harsh bark of automatic weapons. A bullet ricocheted off the wall near Reynolds, sending a shower of debris into the air. He ducked instinctively, firing back at the muzzle flashes in the distance. He could feel the tension in the team, the urgency in their movements. They needed to reach the Chinook, but the enemy was relentless. "Keep moving!" Reynolds shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust and smoke. "We're almost there!" The hostages stumbled behind him, their faces pale and drawn. Daniel Harris, the American photojournalist, could barely keep up, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The other hostages, Khalid and Marie, were equally drained, their eyes wide with terror. Ibrahim, the Yemeni aid worker, lagged behind, his steps faltering. Suddenly a sharp cry rang out. Reynolds turned just in time to see Ibrahim collapse to the ground, clutching his chest. Blood poured through his fingers, staining the sand beneath him. The world seemed to slow down as Reynolds sprinted toward him, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mac, get over here!" Reynolds shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Mac, the team's medic, was at Ibrahim's side in an instant, but one look at the wound told him everything he needed to know. He pressed his hands against Ibrahim's chest, trying to stem the flow of blood, but it was no use. The man's eyes were wide with fear, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, dropping to his knees beside Ibrahim. He reached out, his hands trembling, but there was nothing he could do. The man he had spent weeks with in captivity was slipping away, and there was no way to stop it. Ibrahim's eyes locked onto Daniel's, a silent plea for help that would never come. A final shuddering breath left his body, and then he was still. The world seemed to fall silent around them, the sounds of battle fading into the background as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Mac closed Ibrahim's eyes, his jaw clenched with the familiar pain of loss. There was no time to mourn, no time to process what had just happened. They had to keep moving, had to save the others. But the weight of Ibrahim's death settled on them like a shroud. "We have to go," Reynolds said, his voice rough with grief and urgency. "Now!" The team pulled Daniel to his feet, and they pressed on, Ibrahim's lifeless body left behind in the dust and darkness. The fight to the extraction point was a blur of gunfire and chaos, the SEALs fighting with everything they had to protect the remaining hostages. As they neared the clearing where the Chinook waited, hope flickered in Reynolds' chest. They were almost there, but the enemy was closing in, and they were running out of time. The helicopter's rotors kicked up a storm of dust and sand as it hovered just above the ground. The team pushed forward, the hostages stumbling through the last few meters, but as they reached the clearing, another burst of gunfire erupted from the darkness. Reynolds spun around, firing into the shadows, but the enemy was hidden too well. Marie screamed as a bullet struck her, the force of the impact throwing her to the ground. She lay there motionless, her life snuffed out in an instant. "Marie!" Daniel's voice was raw with grief, but there was no time to go to her. The SEALs returned fire, their anger and desperation driving them forward. They had to get the remaining hostages out. They had to survive this. "Get on board!" Reynolds shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. The surviving hostages were hauled onto the Chinook, their bodies shaking with fear and exhaustion. The SEALs followed, their hearts heavy with the loss of Ibrahim and Marie. The last of the team jumped aboard, and the helicopter lifted off, the roar of the rotors drowning out the sounds of the battle below. As the Chinook ascended, the compound faded into the distance, but the weight of the night's events lingered. The mission had been only partly successful, and the cost had been steep. The losses were keenly felt, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of war. Reynolds stared out into the night, his mind racing with what-ifs and regrets. The mission had been won, but at what price? The faces of Ibrahim and Marie haunted him, their loss a heavy burden that he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. The Chinook's engines roared as it ascended into the night sky, leaving the chaos of the compound behind. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, a fragile silence hanging over the team. The successful extraction of some of the hostages was overshadowed by the loss of others. Marie and Ibrahim, their faces now etched into the minds of the SEALs. Daniel Harris sat slumped against the cold metal wall, his thoughts racing, unable to settle on any one emotion. Relief at being rescued battled with the crushing guilt of survival. He had escaped, but at what cost? The weight of the loss was unbearable, and the faces of Marie and Ibrahim haunted him. Mac moved through the cramped interior, checking on the hostages. When he reached Daniel, he knelt down, searching the journalist's eyes for a sign of how he was holding up. Daniel looked back at him, his expression hollow, a reflection of the turmoil inside. "How are you doing?" Daniel shook his head slowly, unable to find the words. I don't know. I should feel relieved, but they're gone. How do I live with that? Mac nodded, understanding the depth of Daniel's pain. He'd seen it before. The survivor's guilt, the unanswered questions that would never go away. But there was nothing he could say to make it better. All he could do was be there, a steady presence in a sea of uncertainty. We did what we could. We got you out. That's what matters now. Daniel clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. But at what cost? They were so close. Reynolds, sitting across from them, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor of the helicopter. The mission had been successful in the strictest sense, but it didn't feel like it. The cost was too high. The loss of Marie and Ibrahim weighed heavily on him, a stark reminder that even the best plans can go horribly wrong. As the Chinook flew through the darkness, Reynolds mentally replayed the events of the night, searching for the moment where everything had gone wrong. Could they have done something differently? Could they have saved them? These questions gnawed at him, refusing to let go. When the helicopter finally touched down at the forward operating base, the team moved with mechanical precision, helping the surviving hostages off the aircraft and guiding them to the medical tent. The base was alive with activity, but to Daniel, it all seemed distant, surreal. He was free, but he didn't feel free. The weight of the night's events pressed down on him, and he knew it would be a long time before he could even begin to process it all. As the medics took over, Reynolds and his team stood back, their faces grim. The relief of having brought the hostages home was tempered by the grief of the lives they couldn't save. Good work, team, Reynolds said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. We did what we had to. The team nodded, but the words felt hollow. They had accomplished their mission, but the price of that success was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As dawn began to break, the team gathered in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The mission was over, but the memories of that night, the loss, the close calls, would stay with them. The hostages they saved were free, but the ghosts of those they couldn't save would haunt them for a long time to come. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the base as the team gathered in a debriefing room, the weight of the night's mission hanging heavily in the air. The adrenaline that had driven them through the raid was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Reynolds stood at the front of the room, his face drawn and serious. He glanced around at his men, each one silent, their expressions mirroring his own sense of loss and frustration. They had trained for this, prepared for every possible scenario, but nothing could have prepared them for the outcome. We did what we could, Reynolds began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. We knew going in that this wouldn't be easy, that there were risks, but we executed the mission and we brought some of the hostages home. That's something. The room was silent, the words falling flat. It wasn't enough, not for Reynolds and not for his team. The loss of Marie and Ibrahim was a bitter pill to swallow, and the knowledge that they had been so close to saving them only made it worse. Mac shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor. He could still see the image of Ibrahim crumpling to the ground, the life leaving his eyes before they could reach him. The mission was over, but the memories were fresh, and they hurt like an open wound. We're not going to forget what happened out there, Reynolds continued, his tone softening as he looked at each of his men. But we can't let it paralyze us either. We did our jobs, and we did them well. We have to hold on to that. Daniel Harris, seated at the back of the room, listened to the debrief in a daze. The events of the night played over and over in his mind, a loop of gunfire, blood, and loss. The price of his freedom was too high, and he wasn't sure he could ever come to terms with it. After the debrief, the team dispersed, each man dealing with the aftermath in his own way. Some headed to the gym, others to the chapel. Reynolds went to his quarters, where he sat in silence, staring at the wall as he replayed the mission, searching for answers he knew he wouldn't find. Daniel found himself wandering the base, his feet carrying him aimlessly until he reached a quiet spot overlooking the desert. He stood there for a long time, the vast emptiness of the landscape mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. The faces of Marie and Ibrahim haunted him, their loss a heavy weight on his heart. Mac found him there, hours later, standing in the same spot, unmoving. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. It's not easy. What we went through, it's going to stay with us. But you're alive, Daniel. That means something. You have to hold on to that. Daniel didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally he spoke, his voice raw with emotion. They didn't deserve to die, Mac. They were innocent. Mac nodded, understanding the pain in Daniel's words. No, they didn't. But you didn't deserve to die either. You have to live for them now. That's how you honor their memory. Daniel turned to look at Mac, searching his face for some kind of reassurance. How do I do that? Mac put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm and steady. One day at a time, brother. One day at a time. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Daniel felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt since the mission began. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. A small spark in the darkness. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And so, with the memory of those they had lost heavy on their hearts, the team began the slow process of healing. The mission was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. They would carry the weight of that night with them, but they would also carry the knowledge that they had done everything they could. They had brought some of the hostages home, and that was something worth holding on to. So, harrowing stuff, isn't it? Let us know in the comments your thoughts on Al-Qaeda and the terror they spread all around the world. And if you enjoyed the story, please remember to tickle the like button and hit his buddy, the subscribe icon, so you always know when we drop a new story. Also, check out the story on your screen. This one tells the harrowing story of Eddie Ray Routh, the man that murdered Chris Kyle, the American sniper. Enjoy. Until next time, much love.